very interesting times. We have a president and an administration that is challenging decades of neocon foreign policy with the predictable result of hysteria in the mainstream media and in Congress. And there are people who are allies of Donald Trump who are pushing back against this effort to negotiate with Vladimir Putin. In U.S. politics, we have a third rail, and that is foreign policy and also Israel. No judgment. If you want to run for president in the United States and have a chance on being elected, you have to be supportive of Israel. That is just the way it is. But when it comes to Russia and Vladimir Putin, the neocons, the foreign policy establishment, have spent years building him up to be the worst person ever. And during Trump's first term, they essentially criminalized any diplomacy with Russia. They made it impossible for Trump to try to bridge the gap that exists between our two countries after the 2016 election, where our intelligence community accused Russia of so much malfeasance as far as hacking the DNC, which there isn't compelling evidence that happened, interfering with our elections, that didn't happen. But that was the narrative. And because of that narrative, Trump was pigeonholed. And eventually they did impeach Trump based on his conversation with Volodymyr Zelensky back in 2018, 2019, where he momentarily withheld aid to Ukraine because he was concerned about corruption. And so, everything ties together. This war in Ukraine, Russiagate in 2016, the fact that Trump was impeached on a phone call to Zelensky, it all ties together back to that issue of Russia, Zelensky, and our foreign policy being an endeavor that goes back decades. And when Trump wants to talk to Putin, he is ruining everything. All that planning, all that money, all that effort, just to have a president of the United States pick up the phone call and go, "Hey, Vlad, let's work this out." And they cannot have that, and they are pitching a fit. Now, one thing that is good is that it's not just Trump. It's also Marco Rubio. It's also J.D. Vance. So he has people behind him who are echoing the same message. And that is a really good thing. And they are pushing very hard, especially J.D. Vance. So at this point, it would be very difficult for Trump to reverse course and say, you know what, I'm not going to negotiate with Putin. Let's go back to fighting this war. J.D. Vance has said too many things to the effect of, we can't fight this war. There's no objective. Ukraine can't win. We're exhausting our supplies. So all the chips are in the middle of the table. And Trump definitely has bet on ending this conflict. But again, the establishment, the deep state, the neocon foreign policy planners, they are absolutely unhappy with this development, and they are doing everything they can to disrupt it. Now, on that issue, we have a interesting article in the New York Post by Douglas Murray. Now, Douglas Murray is an English commentator on the right, and he recently spoke glowing about J.D. Vance's criticism of Europe and free speech. So on the issue, Douglas Murray is very good. But when it comes to foreign policy, unfortunately, he reverts back to that establishment thinking. And in his article, he is really pushing the propaganda, and he is lying by omission. So because he's a very prominent figure and this article is getting a lot of attention, I want to go through this article and sort of fill in the gaps and show where he is being misleading by not giving you all the information, the full context, so you can better understand why this war in Ukraine is happening. And that is the key thing. When you have a complex issue, the elites, the establishment, they rely on the public being too distracted to actually dig into the details to determine whether or not they are getting good information. And if you're a busy person, you got a family, you're working 60 hours a week, you don't have time to research everything you're being told. So you read an article by Douglas Murray. He sounds very authoritative. You like him. You have a tendency to want to believe what he's saying. But again, if you actually dig into the details, he is really pushing establishment propaganda, and he is doing a disservice for the effort to get to some sort of peace. So I do want to read this article, and it's titled, Mr. President, Putin is the dictator, and 10 Ukraine-Russia war truths we ignore at our peril. So we're going to find out 10 truths, allegedly, from Douglas Murray regarding the Russia-Ukraine war. So let's dig in. And he begins here. This has been a dizzying and disorienting week in international diplomacy, one with wild implications for Ukraine, the future of America's standing in the world, and President Trump's legacy. Trump is absolutely right in wanting to end the bloodshed in Ukraine. The suffering has been appalling and the stalemate brutal. But in the furious mix of wild opinions, this week from the White House down, there are at least 10 truths that every American voter must hang on to. In Trump's rush to end the bloodshed, these are also the truths against which any deal will be judged and which will define them when the history books are written. To ignore them or not treat them with the gravity they deserve will also have enormous consequences for decades to come. So, truth number 1. Vladimir Putin started this war despite what Trump said days ago. In February 2022, following a massive buildup on Ukraine's borders, Putin's army launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There is no rational narrative outside of Russian propaganda that blames aggressive actions by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky or NATO that can justify such a military action. This came after Putin had already seized Crimea in 2014 and launched a war in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. And that doesn't include the other wars he started, like that against the tiny nation of Georgia in 2008. Trump is absolutely right that the war never had to start. I believe it is true that it wouldn't have started if he had been in the Oval Office. But it was Putin, not Zelensky, who started the war. All right, so he's saying the war started in February 2022, and that is not accurate. The war started in February of 2014 when the United States backed a coup in Kiev and overthrew the democratically elected president of Ukraine. When that happened, Russia responded by annexing Crimea because Crimea has their naval base, which gives them access to the Black Sea, their only major warm water naval base at Sevastopol. So to allow a Ukrainian government being puppeted by the United States to take control of Crimea for Russia, they could not allow it to happen. So as soon as that coup happened, Russia responded by annexing Crimea, and the overwhelming majority of the population there actually wanted to be with Russia. There have been polling done by Western organizations that show just that. So when Russia did this annexation, basically Crimea said, we don't care. We're more than happy to go along with it. Along with that, the southeast region of Ukraine, which is heavily pro-Russian, ethnic Russian speakers, they were very supportive of the president that was overthrown. And when he was overthrown, they felt disenfranchised because he was a person that was more neutral and was, yes, a little more pro-Russia than what the West wanted. And they felt that, my gosh, our guy was pulled out, overthrown with the help of the United States. We're not going to go along with this. And that's when they said, we're going to be autonomous. We're not going along with this government. And that's when the Civil War started. And it went on for year after year after year, almost 9 years before Putin invaded in February of 2022. So it's a complicated matter. And during those several years, there were all sorts of negotiations that involved the Europeans that tried to settle the matter. And the nationalists in Ukraine did not want to accept any autonomy for a region that would be pro-Russian, speak Russian, and recognize Russian culture. In Ukraine, there is a faction who are Banderites. And there's a man named Bandera who during World War II was very anti-Russian. And he actually cooperated with the Nazis at the time. And he was a hardcore nationalist. And the former head of the Ukrainian military, Zaluzny, actually has a picture where he has a photo of Bandera right behind him. So these Banderites are very, very right-wing, very nationalist, and some would argue racist as well. And they would not stand by having this separatist region in the southeast. And that's where the Azov battalion that you've heard of were fighting. They were fighting against these separatists. And that civil war had raged on for several years. And as was going on, people like John McCain and Lindsey Graham came to Kiev to say to the Ukrainians and speaking to the Ukrainian military, saying, "We have your back. We're going to go to Washington, get you weapons, so you guys can go on the offensive against the Russians." That's what Lindsey Graham said in 2016 to the Ukrainian military in Kiev. So this war, this struggle has gone on for a long time. And again, you read this thing here, February 2022, Putin's army launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There's no rational narrative outside of Russian propaganda that can explain this. Well, there's a whole lot that happened there that Douglas Murray hasn't informed you about, either because he's very ignorant, which I don't believe, or he's purposely leaving that out because he is trying to spread propaganda. Again, it's a very complicated matter, and simplifying it to the invasion in 2022 is preposterous. And he also points out that Trump wasn't president, and if Trump were president, the invasion would not have happened. And he's right. But what does that say? That says that Biden being president is part of the reason why Putin invaded. Now the narrative is that's because Putin saw Biden and was like, oh, Biden's weak. That's a good time to invade because Biden's president. That's not it. The reason why he invaded was because he tried to reach out to the Biden administration, to Blinken, to Sullivan, and he got nothing. They basically blew him off. And he realized, Putin, that he couldn't work with these guys. There was no diplomacy to be had. And he felt, I have no choice but to invade now. And that's what he did. So, yes, if Trump were president, they would not have invaded, but for a different reason than what is implied. Truth number 2. Russia is fighting for conquest. The Russian Federation invaded Ukraine in 2022. Whatever you think of the country or its leadership, Ukraine is an internationally recognized sovereign nation. Putin invaded in the hope of devouring the country wholesale. By contrast, Ukraine has absolutely no territorial ambitions in Russia. Now, remember what I just talked about, the Civil War, the U.S.-backed coup. And after that coup, what did we do? Not to rhyme. We put in 14 CIA spy bases on the Ukraine-Russian border. So there you are, you're Putin. You watch this coup that involves the USA and the CIA. And then after it happens, the CIA moves in and starts putting all these observation bases on the border with you. What would you think if you were Putin? What would you think if you were the United States and that happened on the Mexican border with, say, China doing that? What would we do? Well, we know we do. We would invade. So Russia watched all this, and they tried to negotiate for 8 years, from 2014 to 2022, saying, hey, stop what you're doing here with your CIA bases, with your coups. Not to mention, by the way, we put in multiple, dozens actually, of, as Victoria Nuland said in her testimony, biological research facilities. She said it very carefully. And after the invasion, she says, we're very worried that these facilities could be taken by Russia. And why is that? Because they're researching how to cure the common cold? No. They were doing some things there that they couldn't do in the United States due to our laws, and God knows what it actually was. So Putin's watching all this happen over years before he finally invaded in 2022, when he thought, I've exhausted all my options. They're not listening. I'm going to move now. And, one of the reasons why he picked that time as well was the Ukrainians were building their forces to invade the Donbass, to put down the rebellion down there. So Putin was trying to preempt that. He saw that build up and said, okay, now is the time. But the establishment would have you believe that Putin wants to invade all of Europe, and that if he's not stopped in Ukraine, it's Poland next, and then Germany and France. And then they'll also say that Putin's weak. Russia's weak. They're a gas station with nuclear weapons, with a tiny economy. So they have these contradictions. They want to take over all of Europe, but they're this pathetic military armed with shovels. And that's, again, their propaganda falls apart, and they have these contradictions because they're just throwing things out there. They have zero consistency. He continues, and remember, the brutality of Russia's actions among the multitude of depravities and war crimes committed by Putin's army has been the abduction of some 20,000 Ukrainian children. Who wants to live in a world where the strong can simply devour the weak and kidnap little children by the thousands? Why hasn't the U.S. put their release at the top of the list of its negotiating demands? Now, obviously in wartime, you're going to have a lot of people killed. And there were a lot of children in the Donbass region where the war is occurring that didn't have their parents, and they were moved to Russia, to the Moscow area. And it's not quite the kidnapping that he's suggesting here. It's a little more complicated than that. It wasn't like Russia was like, yeah, we're just going to grab kids for no reason at all and just kidnap them. No. It was much more complicated. War going on, people being killed, kids without parents, and they were moved to a safer area. Not quite the kidnapping he is sort of describing it as. All right. Truth number 3. Ukraine is fighting for its independence. Most Ukrainians do not want to be part of Russia. They do not want to be governed from Russia. The vast majority want to live in an independent, sovereign country in control of its own future. Generally true. But again, who are the people who were fighting that civil war for 8 years? It was the Ukrainian government and the western part of Ukraine and the central part of Ukraine against the southeast, the Russian speakers, the ethnic Russians. So we would not allow the United States and Ukraine, they would not allow these two oblasts to be autonomous because they did not want to be part of that government. So all this could have been stopped if the Ukrainian government said, okay, we will recognize the autonomy of these two oblasts because they're Russian speakers and ethnic Russians. They'll still be part of Ukraine, but they'll have some autonomy. They could not accept that. But yes, the other parts of Ukraine do want to be Ukrainian. But again, the irony, they're fighting over parts of Ukraine that were leaning toward Moscow in the first place. Putin does not want to invade Western Ukraine. He doesn't want to, or try to control that. In Western Ukraine, there are ethnic Ukrainians. There's people there who are ethnic Poles. To try to control that area, it wouldn't be worth it. It'll be a huge pain. He just wants that other region that have the Russians down there. Truth number 4. Ukrainians are not Russians. Ukrainians and Russians are not one people, a single whole. As Putin wrote in a 2021 essay, he's also simply lying in his assertion that modern Ukraine is entirely the product of the Soviet era. Ukrainians and Russians are two separate ethnic groups. They speak different languages and have distinct histories. Generally true, but he's sort of underplaying how close the two groups are. They're sort of like, sister nations, brother nations, cousins. In fact, the current head of the Ukrainian military, Syrskyi, he is an ethnic Russian. He was born in Russia. His parents still live there. The reason he is a Ukrainian is because he was in the military in Ukraine when the Soviet Union collapsed. And he remained in Ukraine and became a Ukrainian, but he's actually an ethnic Russian. So clearly there is a closeness between the two people, and they do share a lot. Is Putin being 100% accurate by saying that Ukraine is entirely a product of the Soviet era? It's more complicated than that, again. But they are very close together. And Ukraine, and historically, has been very important to Russia. All the invasions into Russia beforehand, whether it's the Germans or the French, have gone through Ukraine. So it's a very critical area that Russia does not want to allow the West to control. They're very, very sensitive about that. And then we have truth number 5. Putin is a dictator. Putin has ruled Russia with an iron KGB fist since coming to power in 1999. He has ruthlessly squashed independent media, ended free and fair elections, crushed civil society, and killed his political opponents. And not just inside Russia, but around the world. People who live in Russia or inside Russia and express any opposition to the war are imprisoned. Is he a dictator? He's an authoritarian ruler. Although I think that we underplay how popular he is. Every time Western organizations poll Russians, they find his popularity to be very, very high in the 70s and 80s. So Putin's is much more popular than, say, American leaders, where it's much more divided. Are the elections free and fair? You know, it's funny we say that. For the last several years, we in the United States have been arguing about whether or not we in the United States have free and fair elections. And in my personal opinion, there is a lot of things going on, especially in 2020, that definitely raised an eyebrow. But as far as the United States, when a country has an election and we don't like the results, we say it's not free. We say it's not fair, it's rigged. But if we do like the result, all of a sudden it's a fair election. So we're sort of, again, hypocritical here. We have our own problems, and we cast judgments on other countries on whether or not they have fair elections based on, what the results are. So we're very self-serving here. And again, my opinion as an American, I don't particularly care about the inner workings of Russia. All I want is relations that are decent because we are both nuclear superpowers. Exporting Americanism, we need to stop that. It's a failure, and all it does is bring trouble. So I don't particularly care that much if Putin's, quote unquote, a dictator. Every government around the world has their dirt and kill people. They're all killers. If you're a head of state of a major country, you're a killer. Whether it's George Bush invading all these countries, Obama destabilizing Syria and Libya and having his drone programs, they're all killers. Let's not play that game. Truth number six. Zelensky is not a dictator. So, he did cancel elections. He did ban certain political parties and certain independent media. So if he's not a dictator, well, he's doing everything a dictator would do. A political outsider, Zelensky won the 2019 presidential election, which was relatively free and fair. He has a 57% approval rating, not the 4% Trump claimed. Now, where does that number come from, 57%? Well, there is actually a organization that polls, and this organization, I'm going to shock you here, is funded by the United States. So any polling number, you can't trust it. Now, is it 4% like Trump claims? No, it's not. We know what Trump does. If he doesn't like you, he takes whatever he has and makes it worse. So if the number is, say, 15%, he's going to say 10%. If it's 10%, he's going to say 4%. That's what Trump does. He likes to really rub it onto his opponents when he's going after them. So he's not very happy with Zelensky, so he said 4%. So that's not right, but 57%, no chance. It is not 57%. Unlike in Russia, Ukraine has a vibrant, independent media that holds the government to account. No, it does not. That's garbage. Despite claims to the contrary by internet swamp creatures and Russian bots. So if you say that there's not independent media there, you're a swamp creature and a Russian bot. Well, it just came out that 90% of the independent media in Ukraine is funded by USAID. So what do you think they're going to say? Independent free things? No. They are taking the position of the Zelensky regime and the West generally. And you can go research this. You can go figure this out yourself. It's not hard to find. So he says this, Douglas Murray, and you go, is he ignorant or is he simply lying or admitting? And in my opinion, he's way too smart to not know that. And so if you know it and you're lying about it, you're spreading propaganda. Truth number 7. Russia is not a friend of the U.S. It is a hostile nuclear armed state that resents American power and the world the U.S. has built. It has ever closer relations with China, Iran, and North Korea. In fact, all of its main friends are countries that are the biggest foes of America. Now, why is Russia aligned with China? Because we, the United States, cut them off, threw them out of SWIFT, threw on sanctions. We've been moving NATO toward them for the last 20 years. We've made it clear the last 20 years that we do not want to be good friends with Russia. And in their position, they say, okay, we need to find people who do want to do business with us, and that is China. So China and Russia working together is our fault. Russia had no other choice. Is Russia our friend? Not particularly, but they're not our enemy. Same thing with China. They are a nuclear armed power. They are a nuclear superpower. So in my position, we and Russia should work together because of our nuclear stockpiles. The world is getting smaller, and we have to get along, or else we're going to blow ourselves up. And with all the minerals and the gas and oil that Russia has, it would do wonders for the European economy if Russia was having healthy relations with the EU. We've seen what has happened to the German economy being cut off from Russia. So it benefits nobody, Russia included, to not have good relations. But that has been primarily because the United States, because of our long-term political planning, does not want a strong Russia. That's why we move NATO toward Russia. That's why we have color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia. That's why we have USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy trying to destabilize countries like Belarus. That is why Russia and China ban these organizations from operating in their country, because they know what they're trying to do, project soft power and trying to undermine the regimes there. So we're not friends, but in my opinion, that's more because of the actions of the United States. Truth number 8, Ukraine is a friend of the U.S. Ukraine wants to be part of the American-led order. Its people and government are deeply pro-American. Since the start of the Russian invasion, the Ukrainian men and women I have seen fighting at the front lines are fighting the Russian military to protect their loved ones and their country. They also do it in the knowledge that if they fail, other countries will be next. So that last part there, if they fail, other countries will be next. Again, Russia is pathetic. They got a small economy. They're a gas station with nuclear weapons. Yet, if Ukraine falls, they're going to march across Europe and invade Poland, Germany, and France, and Spain. So we badmouth Russia and call them pathetic, but on the other hand, we say that they're going to march across Western Europe if they're not stopped, and that's again these hypocritical positions. Now, as far as the people fighting, I will always say this: for the Ukrainian men and women who are on the front lines, I feel terrible for them. They are fighting for their country. They are fighting for their loved ones, irrespective of what their leadership has done to them. It's not their fault. And in many cases, they're being dragged off the streets forcibly and forced to the front line. So they have my respect, and we should have nothing but compassion for them. I see a lot of people saying in the United States who are reasonably fed up with how much money we've given to Ukraine and all the corruption there. And they say F Ukraine. I think it's a little cold, a little callous. I say, I say they've lost a lot of people, and their country is destroyed. And for a lot of people in Ukraine, it wasn't their fault. They are a victim of their government, just like we in the United States. We can be a victim of our government. So nothing but respect for the people in Ukraine actually fighting. As far as Ukraine being a friend of the U.S., to be honest, before this conflict started, I don't think most Americans even knew that Ukraine existed. So if they're friends with us, it's a one-way thing because we had no clue about you guys until all this broke out. Should we have good relations with Ukraine? Of course, just like Russia, just like China, just like everybody else. But to act as if there's this close kinship between the two countries, that frankly doesn't really exist. Excuse me. Truth number 9. Putin cannot be trusted. This isn't just a statement of fact. It is also something that 81% of American voters agree on. I wonder why. All the propaganda the last 8 years. Of course, most Americans would agree with that because they've been propagandized. Putin has invaded multiple countries in violation of every international treaty. He has interfered in multiple elections in his nearest neighbors. He has violated international agreements, including the INF Treaty with the United States. Wow. Invading countries, interfering with elections. Who does that more than anybody on this planet? Oh, the United States. We interfered with Ukraine. We are interfering constantly all the time. If you go on to Wikipedia, even there, they will admit, and Wikipedia is very pro-establishment, that we have overthrown, I think, 80 or 90 democratically elected governments. We are constantly interfering. And George Bush, he invades Afghanistan. He invades Iraq under Obama. We have the CIA-backed effort to overthrow Assad in Syria, destabilize Libya. So we're going to talk, and who has Putin invaded? Okay, Ukraine. They're involved with Georgia. Countries on the border where they have vital interest. That's where Putin has focused. But as far as spreading their tentacles across the world, it's the United States, not Russia, that does that. Same with China. Who has China invaded? So we talk about Chinese aggression. How about American aggression? Excuse me. He has lied to American presidents and European leaders his whole career. He has lied to Trump even since Trump has been back in office. Most recently, Putin promised that he wouldn't target Ukrainian energy facilities. We have lied to Russia so many times. We were so deceptive, especially during that period of time from 2014 to 2022, when he was trying to negotiate some end to the civil war in Ukraine. And we have been, I hate to say, far more untrustworthy than Vladimir Putin. He has honestly been pretty straightforward with what he wants. The problem is most Americans, judging by this poll here, saying that 81% of Americans don't trust him. Everything he says is ignored by the U.S. press, so most Americans don't know about it. But you know what? 81% of Americans don't trust Putin. I think the Democrats in Congress are polling around 19% with the American people. So we don't trust Putin. Well, we don't trust Putin any more than we approve of the Democrats in our U.S. Congress. So that's which is pretty pathetic. And truth number 10. American aid to Ukraine is not being wasted. Wait a second. Didn't Volodymyr Zelensky just say that they couldn't account or hadn't received $100 billion, even though we allegedly gave them over $200 billion? And we also have those stories of Ukrainians in wealthy parts of Europe running around with brand new cars and nice new villas. There's a lot of corruption in Ukraine, and that money is being wasted. And in fact, a lot of the weapons we send to Ukraine aren't going to the battlefield, to the front lines. They're popping up in Syria, with the cartels in Mexico, with all these disreputable groups around the world. That's where all of our weapons are showing up at. Not all of them, but a lot of them are, because the people receiving them, in the military, are very corrupt. So yes, they're using them to fight, but a lot of it is being wasted. But he continues, nobody would argue Ukraine is a country without corruption, but that does not mean its people and sovereignty should not be protected. We should also remember which country in this war is truly corrupt. Russia is one vast kleptocratic state led by Putin and a small cartel of oligarchs who have made themselves among the richest people on earth, all while keeping most of the Russian population in a state of poverty that would not be believed by most of us in the West. Well, here's the truth. All major countries are led by rich people, the billionaire class, in the UK and in the United States. As a matter of fact, he talks about poverty in Russia. I talk about this all the time. In the 90s, when Russia was struggling, they reached to us and said, can you help us with our economy? And we basically spit in their face. And a handful of oligarchs took over their economy and were controlling Yeltsin, the first democratically elected president. And these oligarchs, they made themselves, in a very short amount of time, tens of billions of dollars by buying up Russian assets, state assets, for pennies on the dollar. And when Vladimir Putin became president, he basically chased them out of Russia, and they all fled to London, where they had their billions stored, because they always knew that other foot would drop, and one day they might be chased out of the country for their theft and pillaging. And they ran to London and complained about a lack of democracy in Russia when these guys were robbing the country blind. But after Putin became president, if you look at the per capita GDP and the standard of living in Russia, it has risen steadily over the last 25 years. And Putin is dealing with a country that has a society that isn't like the West. There's a lot of killers in Russia, a lot of oligarchs, powerful people that he's navigating. So is Putin a great guy? No, I'm not arguing that. But considering the circumstances, he has moved Russia into a better place. And even the West, rich countries in the West, we do have our ruling class of billionaires who manipulate our politics as well. So that is not unique to Russia. Putin and his cronies have been accumulating power and wealth all their careers, and they will torture and kill anyone who exposes this corruption. Remember his political opponent, Alexei Navalny, and the lawyer Sergei Magnitsky? It is easy to expose corruption in Ukraine, but in Russia, it is deadly. Now, Navalny was an opposition figure who challenged Putin. He was probably being backed by a U.S. intelligence, and he did die in Russian custody. Now, what is interesting is that the head of the Ukrainian intel services, Budanov, came out and said that he did die of natural causes and that he wasn't murdered by the Russians. Which is interesting, because why would the head of the Ukrainian intelligence services defend Russia and say that Navalny wasn't killed by them? Unless he wasn't. So in the case of Navalny, perhaps Russia was not actually responsible for that. Although, even though the Ukrainians did say that it was natural causes, as an outside observer, I will say it is a little funny that he did die in custody at a fairly young age. I think he was in his late 40s. But as far as exposing corruption in Ukraine, if you go on X, they're talking about the journalist or YouTuber Gonzalo Lira, who was arrested by the Ukrainians and died in their custody. And he said, if I get arrested by the Ukrainians and put in jail because he lived in Ukraine, he said, I will die. And he was an American citizen. And we asked, there are journalists who asked the State Department about his arrest. And this was during the Biden administration. And they basically blew it off. And as he said, guns all ear, he did end up dying in Ukraine's custody. And there is a list of people that Ukraine wants to see killed. There's a kill list. And there are journalists on it. There was one journalist in Moscow who was giving a presentation at a restaurant, and an operative being controlled by Ukraine intel planted a bomb that killed him. So we have, operations by Ukrainian intelligence targeting journalists outside the country for whatever perceived things, wrongdoing that they've done that against Ukraine. So Ukraine definitely is not a country you want to cross, and they will and have killed people for crossing them. So I don't view them as being a less corrupt country than Russia. Ukraine is corrupt, and unfortunately, our State Department apparently won't even take up for U.S. citizens who are in the grasp of the Ukrainian government, which is really, really pathetic considering we are funding that government. But that shows you just how dedicated the Biden administration was to supporting Ukraine, even at the expense of the lives of American citizens, which is, in my opinion, downright pathetic. And finally here, he's talking about the money spent in Ukraine. Besides, according to the Department of Defense, some $58 billion out of the $183 billion in Ukraine aid has been spent in America. It is money that has benefited American workers and industries. The war has also degraded the military of one of the despotic regimes in the world and reduced its threat not just to Europe, but America, without one U.S. soldier being killed. It has also sent a strong deterrent message to China, Iran, North Korea, not to try the same. Well, I guess if you work for the military-industrial complex, for Northrop Grumman, you've made some more money, so good for them, because if there's one group of people who need more money because they're struggling, well, it's the military-industrial complex. That's a joke. And as far as degrading the military, Russia has rebuilt their entire military the last 3 years. They actually were relatively weak when they invaded back in 2022. Their army has grown. They have beefed up their military-industrial complex. They are outproducing the entire West when it comes to armaments. So Russia is not weaker. They're stronger. And as far as China, Iran, North Korea being deterred, all we're showing is that we are willing to sacrifice a proxy, in this case Ukraine, for our benefit. So Taiwan, pay attention. You could be next. And there are a whole bunch of countries that the United States has sacrificed for our goals. And forgive me if I say that that's kind of evil, allowing hundreds of thousands of people to die so that some political planners in Northern Virginia can check off their list. I think that's cold. That is not a strong argument for me that we are weakening or scaring our enemies. Believe me, China, they are not scared. So sacrificing Ukraine for our geopolitical objectives has served no purpose. And that is what is so sad, is that this war, it will end. And Ukraine will be wrecked. The United States will have lost money, having funded it. And Russia will have those provinces in Ukraine, which is more than they were asking for 3 years ago. So what was it all for? It was all for naught. And we planted, probably at this point, at least 500,000 Ukrainians for absolutely nothing. The most avoidable war ever. And if Americans understood exactly what happened, they would be disgusted too. And that is why the establishment is working double time to try to convince us that this war was necessary and needs to continue, because we pull that curtain back and we expose all their lies and the fact that this war was unnecessary. Well, people will start questioning everything else. We already questioned the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war, and we started questioning this war. I mean, at some point, you would think that this grift will stop working. But, unfortunately, we know that the military-industrial complex, they just move on to the next one. So, say, for example, if this war gets shut down, what's going to happen? They're going to pivot toward Taiwan, and we're going to do the same thing again. China's being aggressive. They're not respecting international norms. Blah, blah, blah. Same thing again. And you would think the American people would finally go, oh, wait a second. These neocons, they're always wrong. And every war they fight is a disaster. But we're slow learners. And I think the main reason why we don't learn our lesson is all these wars happen somewhere else, thousands of miles away. And we don't really pay the cost for these wars. And that's why we forget our lesson that we learned, and we move on just to repeat the same mistake over and over and over again. So hopefully Trump does stop this war. But after he does, it's not over, because now it's the South Pacific, or the South China Seas and Taiwan. And we're going to have to work overtime to prevent a war from happening over there in the next few years. So it never stops. You're constantly fighting to maintain peace and stability. And that is a challenge for Americans and for the Trump administration. Well, that is it for now. If you are new to my channel, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.